Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our new series called People of Interest Through the Lens of Astrology. Jenny, who are we talking about today and why?
I know, right? We are talking about Pope Francis, who recently passed away on April 21st. So he is hugely in the news right now, and he's got a cool chart. So that is who we're talking about today. May he rest in peace.
Yes. Okay, so do you want me to just open the chart? Is it actually, you know what we should do is give people the information. He was born on December 17th, 1936 at 9 p.m. in Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Hmm.
So
That's right.
and what is important or significant that immediately jumps out in his chart?
Well, there's a few things I could say right away, but let's just talk right off the bat about that Uranus right next to the midheaven. That's a pretty loud signature, don't you think?
That is a very,
Um,
very loud statement.
yeah.
Absolutely. And first of all, why don't we talk about what the MC means and what it
Yeah.
signifies?
Yeah, the MC is the midheaven of the chart, and it signifies the highest point in the chart. Laurie and I use whole sign houses, so in the way we use it, it doesn't always, isn't always sitting right at the top, but mathematically it is. It's the highest point in the sky. So when you have a planet like Uranus next to it, that's a heck of a statement because Uranus is a slow-moving planet, and it really makes a statement about this person being a change maker. So that, I think in a simple term, what do you think of with
Well, I think that, anytime one of the outer planets is tied in really tightly to the most important points, the ascendant or the midheaven, or some of the really personal planets, we know we have a person who is either impacted very powerfully by the larger forces of the culture and or impacts the larger forces of the culture.
yeah.
So this person clearly has a lot of very unusual dynamic energy in the world. The thing that's interesting here too is that point, that midheaven with whole sign house system falls not in his 10th house, but his 11th. And what does that say to you?
Well, the 11th house is the house of groups in simple terms. So it kind of it imports those 11th house topics into like the 10th house vocational focus, I would say. But in just simple terms, I just see big crowds. I think of him in front of the big crowds. I mean, during his final day was Easter. That was his final moment of addressing the crowds. And I think about that huge crowds. That's a pretty good summary of thinking what Uranus conjunct midheaven might mean.
Yeah,
Yeah, in his
absolutely.
house.
Yeah,
Yeah,
anytime I see somebody's midheaven in the 11th house, I think that they're going to be in front of crowds of people, groups of people,
yeah,
not hidden away in an office, but in a very public groups. Yeah,
yeah.
that's very clear in this chart. Now, there's so
Mhm.
many directions we could take this
Mhm.
contemplation in. And I do want to give a little plug here for my book. If you want to learn how to really look at natal charts, this book will really help you with that process a lot. So the book is How to Read and Interpret a Birth Chart. It's written by me, Laurie Farrington. You can order it from your local bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever. But it will really help you understand how we're looking at charts and how you can really explore your own and other people's charts as well.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
what's the next thing when we look at this?
I do encourage people to pick up a copy of Lori's book. I'm in the middle of it right now, and it's awesome. It really is like a handbook. So I just want to throw that in. It's true. It's not a
Thank
shameless
you.
plug. It's just reality.
Thank you,
Well, I
Jenny.
think let's kind of back it down a little bit and make it a little more simple. Let's start with if that's okay with you. Like I was
Absolutely.
thinking, let's look at that Sagittarius sun. Like, what does Sagittarius bring, and why is it conjunct that other little upside down nose ring looking thing? So I think that's the next question. What do
Yeah,
you
I,
have?
I think that is really interesting. Anytime you see either the sun or the moon very close to the south or north node, which is what this is. This is the north node that we here see right beside his sun. Anytime either the moon or the sun is very close to that point, either one of the nodes, we know that this person was born very close to an eclipse.
Hmm. I gotta make one little change that. It's only the sun because the moon can sometimes conjunct it, and it isn't necessarily an eclipse. It's really the
Okay,
sun. It's about the just want to so the sun conjunct the north node. It like it's so close. I had to go run to my little ephemeris and look it up. And so 4 days before his birth was a solar eclipse
right.
in Sagittarius. So that kind of, and I always like whenever I see that, I'm like, okay, this person was born so tight to an eclipse. What does that mean? And a lot of times I do think it is connected to charts of people who are here to really, I don't know, make the wheel of time change, like to really bring this huge change to things, for better or for worse. Not always, but I do notice it in the charts of some of these celebrities have a massive impact. I always think of eclipses as pivot points. So to be born at this pivot point, what does that mean? And certainly worth an investigation in the chart. So
And
yeah,
then with the sun being in Sagittarius, which is so much about belief and expansion and understanding and, really that perspective of, yeah, bigger picture things. So, he really embodies a way of changing perspective. I think of that with this.
yeah, and I think in our title we have something about vision. This would be the place you'd look at the vision. I always associate Sagittarius with that vision because it's the symbol of the arrow flying over the landscape. So it has this viewpoint. It's a fire sign, but it has this viewpoint that is really helpful, lends itself to that idea, and it can definitely be spiritual vision. In
Yeah.
his case, certainly it was. So yeah,
Yeah, and it's interesting because Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Jupiter's so close. I mean, I personally am not going to call it conjunct because it's in another sign. Technically, by degrees, it is conjunct the sun. Um, I think it's important enough to just note that Jupiter, being in Capricorn brings in the seriousness of the vision as well.
yes. Yeah. And when you think about Capricorn being in the seventh house, anytime he sits down across from another person, they're receiving that kind of Capricorn energy, the seriousness, the maybe even some strategy, but this real authority. And I can't imagine, not that I ever saw Pope Francis in person, but I can't imagine, I mean, he must just have imbued that sense of authority like that, yet his Saturn is in Pisces. So I imagine that the understanding of suffering would be in his eyes as well. But yeah, I really, and you have to think about the fact too that again, he's born at an eclipse. So that also means, or, a couple, almost 2 weeks later was the other piece in the eclipse pair. So that meant the sun actually did conjunct Jupiter before that second eclipse. So it does kind of give it this.
Oh, yeah.
There's no question, right, that the
Yeah.
Jupiter Capricorn being part of the mix.
Well, that is interesting that the next eclipse, yeah, the sun would
Yeah.
have gone over Jupiter. And it also, where my mind immediately goes from there too, is that this Jupiter is opposite the ascendant. The ascendant is Cancer, and you look at him and you can see the Cancer rising, can't you?
Yes.
He's got kind of a little moon face.
Yeah.
I really like his face. But that moon that rules the chart being in Aquarius and Jupiter being in Capricorn, both of those are ruled by Saturn in Pisces.
Mm.
Just boom, boom, boom. And it brings this authority. You could look at this Saturn in Pisces in the ninth house and just see that spiritual authority. That's so clear there.
Yeah, and absolutely, and also just the idea that wherever you have Saturn in your chart suggests a place where maybe you've had to do something alone, you've had to work really hard, maybe you've had some kind of failure in that part of your life that you've had to reckon with. And I do know that if you look back into his history, there were times when he made decisions when he was a young man that actually caused a lot of harm. And I would imagine that he learned a lot through his own suffering because that's what he brings to the table in his older years when he is Pope he really brings a much kinder, softer faith to Catholicism. He
Yeah.
encouraged the community to embrace like the LGBT community. He encouraged there to be much more support around, I mean, like single parents, single mothers. I mean, there's a lot of things he was more chill about divorce. There's all these different things. And what I would say when you see that Saturn in the ninth house is just to ask if you were sitting down across from this person, what kind of lessons, like what have you had some hard lessons around, what, that you've had to expand your mind and open your perspective through suffering that happened? And I think he would have said, yes, yeah, and would have talked
And
about it.
yeah, I mean, there's so many directions we could think about that. That opposition between Saturn and Neptune speaks to that. I think that suffering and
Yeah.
the learning from suffering. I,
Hmm.
you know, there's so much in this chart. I want to just jump into all of it at once. There's a lot here. And, the kindness that he brought to all of this is really, you think of authority. When we think of authority, we can go into that kind of hard line authority.
Hmm.
But for him, it really does go into humanitarian understanding, that moon that rules the chart
Yeah.
in Aquarius with Venus. This is a really powerful understanding on an intellectual level of humanitarian issues.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's a good thinking about that. The moon in Aquarius tends to be, there can be an emotional struggle with detachment when one becomes too detached from emotional issues. And that could be part of it. But also, I like the idea of thinking, and there's space. There's space to step back and examine what is going on. And in the eighth house, it's what is going on with other people? What kind of suffering are other people experiencing? And bringing that into his mindset and being able to look at that. And I think I mean, actually, when I opened this chart, that was the first thing I saw. And I just immediately saw, well, there's the humanitarianism, the big perspective of, that we're living all on one planet. We're figuring out how to live together. And Pope Francis understood that. And you can see because he's got Venus there too, the Venus really brings this softness as well to the moon, this real understanding in on a personal level. If you sat down with him again, I imagine this personable nature, this real understanding with Venus conjunct the moon. So that really stood out to me right away.
Yeah, it's interesting because you think, I mean, if you were in an intimate partnership with someone with this statement, it might feel kind of cool and detached and, but this is a statement that you would want in your pope, not
Yeah.
necessarily in your husband or wife, because there may be an over objectification, an over coolness. And yet, the ability to see and really understand on an intellectual level where and how people suffer. And that brings us right, I think, to the Chiron conjunct the South Node, which
Yeah.
is one of the first things I saw when I opened up this chart is, oh, Chiron in the 12th house is an understanding of a deep collective wound and coming into the world with the South Node here. It's like he came into the world with, again, it's an air sign, it's an intellectual understanding of how humanity suffers. And then with the moon and Venus there, how individuals suffer. And there's such a powerful understanding of these issues. What a
Hmm.
wonderful, what a wonderful person to have end up in his position.
Yeah, it's pretty unusual, I think.
I think
uh
so too.
yeah. And I mean, so then you think about the fact that, look, that moon and Venus, it's a little bit out of order slightly, but it is in trine. I would say the moon is in trine with Chiron. The moon would have completed that trine not that much later on anyway. So you have a trine there, but we also have a trine from the moon to Mars. So So, folks, we do have another grand trine in air. We did Elon Musk's chart recently, and he had a grand trine in air, and we talked about it there. Um, this is a different one, and part of the reason it's still an air trine, so we're still this is a statement of intellectual self sufficiency, an ability to think for oneself, to think about the wounds of the world, what humanitarian is, and then the fierceness with Mars and Libra to do that, to want to. I always think of Mars in Libra as being really fierce about wanting to include people and wanting to insist that people come and participate. But what makes this grand trine different too is the fact that the moon is involved. Sometimes you see a grand trine separate from sun moon. In this case, we see a grand trine with the moon involved. So it really brings that self-sufficiency indoors. It brings it into an internal space as well, where his emotional nature is wrapped up in this grand trine and has this flow of energy and this innate understanding. So it does, and the fact that it's in the fourth, the eighth, and the 12th house,
And
those
the
are the
fact it
houses.
rules the ascendant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And it really brings in this other more watery, psychic, intuitive type of layer, emotional layer to it, even though it's air signs and even though it's an Aquarius moon. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's interesting because that moon is the highlight here in this grand trine. Clearly, it
yeah,
rules the ascendant, and you can see him as a man who wears his heart on his sleeve. He didn't try to hide his tenderness toward humanity. And then to kind of bring that a step further, I think about that Saturn in Pisces being the only planet, and when I am looking at it this way, I'm not thinking about the outer planets, but all of the other planets. The only one that is in a water sign is that Saturn. And that to me really brings in a sense of he really, really longs for and searches for emotional connection and emotional meaning. And where he is able to find that is in understanding the suffering of others.
yeah. And I always think Saturn in Pisces is lessons in empathy. I mean, there's other ways to look at it, but I think that's one important thing. And I also want to highlight the fact that uh, we also have the planet Pluto. Now, Pluto is in Cancer, and as Laurie said, we don't really count the outer planets. We don't worry about the signs as much because they make generational statements. But what I do want to say about Pluto here is that it is in his first house. And that is extremely powerful. And furthermore, Pluto is not aspected by anything else. It's out of orb. It's not close enough to anything. So it stands alone. And whenever you see a planet standing alone like that, it really brings an incredible power to it. And having Pluto in the first house standing alone is a massive statement of the power he could hold. And now when you fold in the fact that that's his ascendant and it's Cancer, it is this power based on the emotional power of what's going on with the people, and the need to take care of feelings and emotions. And I dare say we're in a time in our lives, a time in our human, span of everything, of really understanding that. We have kind of pushed emotions aside, and now is the time to understand how important feelings are. And I think that Pope Francis, he understood this on a really powerful level. And that's to me what this is saying, what this suggests. So,
One
mhm,
of the things that makes me think about is that his Pluto is at 28 degrees Cancer. So
mhm,
it very soon, relatively soon after he was born, Pluto moved into Leo.
mhm,
And, the baby boomer generation is the Pluto in Leo generation. He very well may be the last pope with a Pluto in Cancer.
mhm.
I I don't know why, but I think that may be significant
Yeah.
because the next pope likely will have a Pluto in Leo, which is a much more generationally selfish generation. Let's face it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Well, that remains to be seen, like who's going to be in that. But I do think it was very unusual to have Pope with this level of empathy, with this level of humanitarianism. Was he perfect? No, he made mistakes in his life. And, a really brilliant theatrical representation of this is The Two Popes, that movie, The Two Popes.
Oh, I
There's a,
loved that movie.
I know, and it's basically about Pope Francis and his relationship with Pope Benedict, and like it's a great movie, but it gives you a little bit of insight into some of the tensions of what was going on. I mean, it's obviously based on a true story. It's not all the truth of the story itself, but they were great friends, even though they were completely opposed in many of their viewpoints. So, um, Jonathan Pryce plays Pope Francis quite well. But
It's
anyway,
a fascinating movie. I
yes, well
love that
done.
movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a movie out right now that I've heard is really good called Conclave.
Oh, okay.
I definitely want to watch it. But
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds
anyway,
good.
what else are we going to say about this chart?
Well, just to finish up the grand trine conversation, whenever you see a
Mm.
grand trine, you also want to notice if there's any oppositions to any of the planets involved.
Mm.
And you want to do that because what it does is it kind of shows you an exit. The grand trine is a very stable structure. It kind of just goes and goes and goes. And whenever you see an opposition, which in this case here is to the sun and the north node, that shows you the exit. So the exit from this intellectual grand trine and these sort of intuitive houses is the spiritual vision
Mhm.
of the Sagittarian sun. And the fire, the ability to, I mean, this is also the preacher, the archetype of the preacher, the ability to hold the attention of the masses up there in front of a crowd. You need a fire sign for that, right? I mean, fire is what can do that. So it makes so much sense to me that we have all these other things going on, but then that's the way out. His ability to deliver his understanding to the masses is what this symbolizes to me.
Yeah,
His oration ability.
yeah.
So
And I would say he certainly accomplished what he was here for.
yeah,
Moving in the direction of that North Node, really embodying that day-to-day
yes,
preacher, explorer, visionary. If you just think about, yeah, him as the visionary with the heart of the humanitarian, with that Aquarius moon, that
yeah,
I mean, that really is who he was and what he embodied.
yeah, yeah. Interesting. And there's a couple other little, what would Noel Till say, the brush strokes of just understanding. One of them is that Mars was the planet that
Mm.
rose before the sun, so that imbues his chart with a little extra oomph, like
Yeah.
he's gonna be doing this. He's gonna be acting on what he sees. There's that one, and then the other. I mean, you're right, Lori. There's tons of things we could talk about. But I think we have to mention the mutual reception between Saturn and
Yes.
Jupiter, don't you think?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. I think that's really interesting. You can look at the chart, and it's in the last chapter of my book, is the chapter about creating a dispositorship tree. And what it really shows you is the hierarchy of the planets themselves. What planets are really in the most positions of power in the chart. And in this chart, the two planets that rise to the top are Saturn and Jupiter, the authority and the visionary. Really, those are the two that hold the most power in the chart. What else do you want to say about that?
Well, they're in mutual reception, which means that Saturn's in Pisces and Jupiter's one of the rulers of Pisces, and Jupiter's in Capricorn, so it's in Saturn's domicile. So they're in each other's signs. So that kind of creates the statement. Um, the other thing I want to say, which kind of explains, well, what is that statement, is that both planets are. I think of both of these as the teacher planets. They're the
Hmm.
social planets, so they're the ones that have something to say about how a person interacts with society. And I always think of, Saturn is the one that teaches through hard lessons, the failures, the difficulties, the resilience that comes from that. And Jupiter teaches by grace. Jupiter sort of gives you the gifts of the rewards of, your ability to open to grace. And so the two of them together are like thinking about how you use both of those. Like there's some real serious and some authority and some, boundaries and structures and people's feet he held to the fire, and there's this extension, his ability to be full of grace essentially,
Mm.
and to see people in a light instead of in a way of judging, you know?
Mm.
So I think it's such a great statement in his chart. And I was like, oh, okay. And
And
it really just made
you
things
know,
sense.
as you think about those as the kind of the heavy hitters of the chart, and all that you said is perfect. I also want to, as you were talking, I'm looking at this and just thinking, okay, so Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces, Saturn rules Aquarius and Capricorn. So this all holds this area of the chart. This is where we, with that being the focus, that's the life is spent for helping others, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the side of the chart that is really speaking to how we respond and react and are in meaningful relationships with others. And above the horizon is out in the world. And so it just really highlights that whole side of the chart as well.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a pretty clear. Um,
Yeah, it's
the other,
pretty clear his life was not for him.
mhm.
It was
Yeah,
for a much bigger purpose.
I agree. And one of the planet I think is worth mentioning here is Mercury. We haven't talked about Mercury. And basically, Mercury in his seventh house is just his ability to speak to the issues at hand, to speak directly to, what's happening. And again, it's in Capricorn, so it's far enough away from the sun that it's in a different sign. Um, and that really brings in his ability to speak about these serious issues. I mean, the way he thinks about it, the way he speaks about it. So it's a simple little added touch, but I think it's important to know that piece.
Yeah, and as you say that, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, the sun, Mercury, and Venus are all in different signs, which I
Yeah.
always think is interesting, because Mercury and Venus are always pretty darn close to the sun. It's always interesting to me when I see them all in different signs. It's like here he is, the visionary, and his thoughts are so serious and his values are so, all encompassing and intellectual, kind of pulls the understanding into more places.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how I think.
And Mercury's right on his descendant, right? It's pretty much directly opposite from the ascendant. And I think what's interesting is that I think Mercury, I mean, who knows what the weather was like or whatever, but it probably was just barely visible. I mean, just barely out from underneath the beams of the sun. And I always think that's interesting. It's just edged far enough away to sort of take the message, the spiritual vision of the sun, and then deliver that message. I mean, that's really what Mercury does in a chart. I really like how it's just barely out of the reaches. You just see it. That is a really potent statement.
Yeah, just as the sun had gone down, there was the little
Just
Mercury.
looked.
Jupiter was too close to the sun, couldn't see Jupiter anyway. So
Mm-hmm.
there you have
Okay.
it. Um,
Okay.
anything else we want to touch on?
Well, I mean, I think, we've kind of covered it. I mean, we talked, oh, you know what we have not talked about, Lori, real quick here is we have sacred tension in the title, and the sacred tension is what we said at the very beginning, Uranus up there in the midheaven, and it's actually squaring Venus, and I think close enough to Moon. This brings in the tension where he feels like he must do something.
How
And
did we miss talking about this?
and I whoops, very important. But it kind of really brings in that title, this idea of what was driving him. This is like, oh, there's a motivation here. Squares are always conflict and growth, and they really provide a lot of motivation, like things that you cannot look away from. And he just felt like he could not look away. He did not want to be Pope. He resisted,
No. I
and
mean, you
he
think
took it.
about that with Taurus on the midheaven. In so many ways, he just wanted a calm, simple life. And then Uranus sits there on his midheaven saying, heck no. And then what he sees in the world with all that challenge, and he has to take action on it.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. I think
I'm glad
that's
he was our Pope, or I'm not Catholic, so I don't really consider him my Pope, but I'm glad he was the world's Pope for the distance of time he was, and we'll
yeah.
see what comes next.
I know, I think he was quite unusual in his humanitarianism. And I, like you, I'm not Catholic, but I do admire some of the things that he did in the world. He was unique and he stood up to some of the powers that be. And this is how it's good to see a person in power using it in this way.
Yeah,
In this way.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we should wrap this up, and I hope you all have enjoyed listening to our little unscripted, unprepared for take on Pope Francis. And I think we might do Beyonce next,
Yeah. So
or
yeah.
we've got a few people have recommended different people, and we'll see
Yeah.
what's next.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.